Hello, and everybody, welcome back to The Only You. I'm back in studio, and Dr. Patino in his office. We're going to be chatting today a little bit about a topic that has been, or at least a term, it's been bandied around a lot, and I think there's a lot of misconceptions about it, and that is the topic of toxic masculinity. Doctor, what is that, and does it really even exist?
Well, um, it is a topic that we hear a lot about nowadays. I have to tell you, the concept of toxic masculinity is not a new concept. It's a concept that, for those of us who have been in the social and psychological sciences for a long time, the concept has been thrown around for a long time. And basically, talks about the exaggerated masculinity that tends to be negative, right? When you and I were talking before this, it was more like a caricature of a man, you know, that in terms of becoming very aggressive, in terms of becoming very, how can I say, negative about women in particular, not being accepting of other people's genders. Um,
Aggressive, misogynistic, bigoted. I mean, really, all the big, those, right?
yes, absolutely. And have we had men like that always? The
Of
answer
course.
is yes, we have. The question is, does it does it really represent men in general, right? And one of the problems we're having, especially kind of parallel to the gender freedom generation, right, in terms of multiple genders and acceptance and love and all that stuff, is that there's been this parallel kind of lazy academic approach of saying if you're not accepting of our change, you're toxic.
Hmm.
So it's really fascinating to me to see how much diversity we have within the gender community. I don't know how many genders we have now. It keeps changing, and everybody's got a different name. And if you know all the names, you're really up there with culture, right? That if you don't accept them, then you're toxic. And especially if you're a man, right? And this comes from the academic idea that toxic masculinity really had a lot to do with homophobia, right?
Hmm.
So men who were very insecure and reacted to people's homosexuality back in the day were really toxic, right? The question is, who are they toxic to? That's actually a concept that is not debated a lot because we want to use the word toxic as a rejecting term, meaning we have to keep them away from us, right? But that leads you to not understanding. And you talked before about um, intellectual laziness, right? I just grab a term and I collect it and I say, if you disagree with me, you're toxic, right? Now, I'm old. I'm 60, almost 62 years old. So I remember the times before the concept of toxic masculinity was the thing, right? And there was something called accepted masculinity, right? So what was accepted masculinity back in the day, which is kind of disappeared slowly, is what we used to call a gentleman, right?
Hmm.
Somebody who was self-secure, not necessarily homophobic, but maybe some gentlemen were homophobic, who were attentive to the needs of women, right? And who were respectful of choices, right? And they didn't have to react with aggression when somebody was challenging them. However, the gentlemen did have a need to protect their women, right? So during the feminization and the free women movements of the 60s, 70s, that has started to be perceived as being quote unquote toxic, right? Because they felt that it was to some degree denigrating to women, right? Why do women need to be protected? Why do we have men to step in front of us? And we saw that last night and a couple of nights ago
On
in
the
the
Oscars.
Oscars, right?
Yep.
When Will Smith gets out of his chair and going and slaps Chris Rock, which I was actually watching the Oscars with my wife because we're both movie nuts, and a lot of stuff started going through my head about that, right? In terms of a number of things. Number one, the fact that that type of masculinity shouldn't be accepted because in that particular case, I do think it's disrespectful to women,
Hmm.
right? I don't think that you have to show that you can protect someone, right? And that you have a need to do that because it reflects lots of insecurity, right? And disrespectful to the women in that particular setting because she didn't ask you to do it,
Yeah.
right? So it's kind of embarrassing at the same time for the women, you know. And I've been in situations, both situations of people getting violent or situations of domestic violence, where um, women never asked for it. So I think that in the traditional sense of masculinity, there needs to be a respect for women's choices, right? And to establish a dialogue. And I think that what was particularly upsetting is that when Chris Rock made the joke, uh, Will Smith was laughing.
Yeah.
So it wasn't until he stopped laughing, probably he realized he should have been laughing. Maybe he was mad at the fact that he was laughing, right?
Maybe.
That he felt that he had to do something about it to in essence protect his women, you know. Uh,
Or
but
really to
this,
protect himself, right?
yeah,
Because now
well,
the perception is he's laughing at it too instead of wait a minute. It's interesting you said what you a second ago. I don't want to go back to that about the permission. Um, my first wife, as you know, was a former German fitness model, so we got a lot of attention when we went out, and it was never comfortable. My current wife is a very attractive woman as well. It was interesting because I remember she asked me about those experiences, and I said, "Well, I of course I had to sometimes step up and do things." I'll never forget. She looked at me. She goes, "Don't ever do that for me. Just don't ever, no matter what. I don't care if a guy grabs my body, whatever it is. I handle it." And I was like, "Whoa, okay." But you know what? That's how she feels about it. She feels empowered enough to handle herself. Doesn't want me to get involved. I think that's a great attitude. But then I've also seen some women on Facebook responding to what happened to Will Smith, saying, "Isn't it great that men are finally standing up for their women again?" So which is it? Which is right?
okay. Well, there are a number of things. You know, the whole issue of masculinity is a complex biological, sociological, cultural issue, right? Psychological issue is not just a thing, right? That just appear out of nowhere, and it's been perpetuated by history, right? So the issue of women being neglected and relegated to a second level functionality has always been there up until recently. I mean, women didn't vote 100 years ago, right?
Mm,
Well, it was about 100 years ago when women started voting. So the role of men and women were very distinct, right? So, um, but the role of male and female is very distinct biologically in a lot of species, not only the human species. So that is one thing. As we have evolved to develop restraints, meaning that's why we have big heads, meaning our frontal lobes are bigger than most other species, meaning that we have the ability to be rational, right? Some more than others. But
mhm,
the reality is that that rationality allows us to make choices. And so, why did we develop all these abilities genetically and psychologically and sociologically? So we can survive as a species, right? So we don't kill each other, you know, and we develop certain rules for, whether it's in the Judeo Christian tradition or in the Oriental tradition or in the Muslim tradition, we develop these rules of behavior, right? The problem is that those rules were developed thousands of years ago and were developed during a time when man was the dominant part of the process, meaning man is the one who hunt, is the one who got the food, is the one who got, it was bellicose, it was going out to fight in wars, right? But we developed certain rules to saying, you're not gonna have sex with your neighbor's wife, right? And you are going to be respectful of other people's property. You're not going to steal from them. Really basic rules that are the basis for our morality, right? The problem for men in particular, and for some women too, is that we can negate our genetics, right? And our impulse control, and we can negate our need to have power and control. I mean, after all, the purpose of manhood is to provide and protect, right?
Mhm.
So when that gets challenged, right, men who are not secure themselves will react with a lot of aggression, right? It doesn't have to be just toward other men. It doesn't have to be toward women in particular. It can be toward a lot of people, and that's how war happens,
Mm.
right? War happens because of narcissism and happens because of power and money. So, so pick your fight, right? And we're seeing that happening right now in Europe, right? There's a lot of egos in the process here, and there's a lot of power and control and money, and so on. Um, Interestingly enough, we need to understand the manhood has to be understood in context of culture, right? And you and I were talking about who are we to judge? Any women, for example, in the Muslim religion and in some Christian religions that take a more traditional form of womanhood, right? Are they wrong? No, they're not.
It's their choice.
Exactly. So choice becomes important, but we have to be respectful of choice, not critical of. And what happens when you start throwing terms like toxic masculinity, what you're making is you're removing the choice. And you're basically saying most men are toxic because they're men.
Mm. Because they're being masculine at all.
And
Before the show, we were talking about that the whole binary choice thing. Excuse me, where it's either A or B, black and white, and it really should just simply be people are men are masculine, and it runs the gradation to toxic or or beneficent. I mean everything in between. Instead, it's being purely labeled as this it's this negative aspect.
well, it is and it is not.
Okay,
There's a perpetuation culturally of toxic masculinity. Let me just give you like an example of that. James Bond, right? James Bond movies. Up
violent,
un-
misogynistic guy, but boy, everybody loves him.
yeah, I mean, up until today, it's still a thing, right? So there's probably some people that identifies with toxic masculinity, whatever that is. There's people who identify with masculinity. There's people who identifies with non-masculinity. You know, um, but in general, there's a cultural perpetuation of the role of men. That's one. There is a family perpetuation of the role of men. In terms of I'm going to be like my dad, right? And I'm going to please my dad by being as macho as he is, right? So there is a gender guidance by example, right? Which people who are in the gender fluid community tend to feel is wrong, right? That we should not be teaching our kids what they should be, and there's a whole debate about that. And then we get into the issue of sh- do we have to accept people the way they are? I think that we have to respect people for any way they want to be. I don't care what your gender is. I don't care what sexual orientation is. I don't care how you dress. I don't care the color of your hair. You know, none of that. We should not judge. Okay. And if they're close to us, we should love them.
But that doesn't mean acceptance, does it?
Acceptance is a very high bar because acceptance requires a lot of change. And we've talked about this before, whether it's with kids who are aggressive or kids who are gender fluid or they're transgender. Um, Let me give you an example. Culturally speaking, it happens a lot. I mean, I see sometimes families that are in very more traditional religions, whether it's Christian type of religions or Mormon religion or Muslim religions, and the kid who is transgender, gender fluid, gets into big arguments with the parents because the parents don't understand
Mm.
and the parents don't accept, right? And sometimes I challenge the kids and I say, well, used to challenge you on this particular issue. Why should your parents accept you, right? And they say, well, because I'm their son or their daughter, right? Okay. So what you're telling me is that your parents have to change all their culture and values and religion because of you. And I said, well, they say yes, right? And I said, well, why don't we make a deal? Why don't we think of them demanding that your parents love you no matter who you are? And let's make acceptance a goal over time, right? Because these kids are coming to me saying, I'm going to kill myself if my parents don't accept me,
Wow.
right? And I think that we're falling into this binary situation now. There's all or nothing, right? Nothing in life is all or nothing.
Mhm.
Nothing. Everything is a matter of degree. How much, how often, right? And how do we communicate? What happens when you get yourself in those binary positions? Communication stops, right? So, I mean, right now, we're seeing two extremes of actually minority people throwing darts at each other, and the rest of us in the middle are kind of ducking, you know?
Having to duck around it, yeah. We're in the line of fire.
And then we don't know where to look. And I think the reality is that we need to stand up and say, listen, stop throwing darts at each other, right? Because the purpose of us being together as a society is to be content, live in peace, right? And be respectful of each other.
Mm.
But don't come and tell a Mormon family that they have to accept anything, or a Christian family, or a Muslim family, right? Because they don't have to accept it. Okay, they have to love and protect their kids, but acceptance is a high bar and it needs to be worked on. So when I talk to the families and I talk to the kids, I say, well, let's start a process where you guys can at least communicate with each other, because demanding acceptance is not going to give you acceptance, right? And I have to tell you, I've had these discussions with kids. I have these discussions with my own children. The or two different generations of kids in in my immediate family, and I get all kinds of different reactions to that, right? I mean, I have an 18-year-old who says that I don't know what I'm talking about and I'm going to get canceled because I say the things I say. And then I have my 35-year-old daughter who's in the business, who is a little more understanding, and then I have a 32-year-old daughter who's a writer, is my tree hugger, and she also tells me that I'm nuts. So, okay, that's fine. But you see, every time I'm saying what I'm saying, I'm trying to plant a seed, because uncertainty is the name of the game.
Mhm.
So, are there men who are aggressive, insecure, homophobic, misogynistic? Absolutely. But that is a minority, right? And we see him every day. We see him on the street, right?
Oh, yeah. I deal with them a lot in my work.
You see, I was driving down to San Diego a week ago, and I stopped by Circle K to get some gas in Yuma. And I'm standing in line to pay a couple of things that I was buying, and this guy walks into the store screaming, "Who's the guy who cut in front of me?" Right? And I just say, okay, so I want to give him a piece of my mind. All right. And in my mind, because it's what I do for a living, right? I was thinking, what is your purpose?
Mm,
What do you think you're going to accomplish by giving somebody a piece of your mind? You know what the answer is? Nothing.
nothing.
I mean, it has the potential to escalate into a physical confrontation, right? Maybe that's what you want. But giving somebody a piece of your mind so they will be what? Intimidated, afraid, so they'll know that you're totally powerful and you can give them a piece of your mind. We need to stop doing things like that. We need to start taking a minute to say, what am I doing this for? Right. And it was fascinating because there was like three people in front of me and he was behind me, right? He was actually mad. He was yelling. screaming, and and I was saying, okay, so where is this going, right? I mean, at this point, I'm saying, well, this guy is going to escalate this, right? And then he left. Eventually, he left, right? So he wasted a lot of time. He didn't accomplish anything, but he showed a lot of toxicity, right?
Mhm.
Because when we behave like that, I always tell my adult patients who are toxic in a masculine way, why don't you practice your toxicity in front of the mirror and tell me what you see? What do you see? You know, I mean, you're seeing an insecure, lonely, angry person who can only feel fulfilled, emotionally speaking, by having power over somebody else.
Mm.
And that is really sad, right? So, underneath all of this, what we call toxic masculinity, there's a number of people who tend to be terribly insecure. And that's a concern of the Oscars, is that Will Smith looked terribly insecure.
Yeah, I mean, and not to be overly stereotypical, actors can tend to be that way. And you're right. I think he felt publicly that he had to do something in order to regain what masculinity I think he felt that he lost. But in the process, he basically committed criminal assault on national TV.
Yeah, that was going to my mind. I mean, at what point is going to the police show up and put him in handcuffs and take him
Yeah.
out, right? And the police didn't do that because Chris Rock did not press charges, right? In LA, you don't press charges, that you won't get arrested. Which I'm not sure that that should be the policy, but because if he had hit a woman,
Mm.
right, would he have been arrested?
Well, again, it's still a crime. I mean, I know here we are in Arizona. You do that to somebody, it's felony aggravated assault.
Yeah, and I'm bringing the example of a woman because frequently, not as much now, but as in the past, women would not want to press charges against their husband or boyfriend because they were being violent with them. So the law had to be changed. It said that this you're gonna persecute this, whether the woman likes it or not.
Mhm.
Because what happens is that um, nobody has a right to put their hands on anybody else unless you're trying to protect your own life,
Absolutely.
right? I mean, there's no justification. I mean, I deal with this a lot in another area where toxic masculinity and power control comes into play, which is kids are being raped,
Mm.
whether because they're on the streets or because somebody walks into their house or somebody they know. And invariably, I hear these girls, mostly girls, sometimes boys, tell me that they always wonder what did they do wrong, right? I mean, and that's where the
Which is
toxic
so
mess.
sad. That's so sad.
Well, yes, and I have to say, number one, you're not a victim, you're a survivor. You survived somebody taking advantage of you, and you're not the problem, they are the problem,
Mhm.
right? And I have to tell them, I have to kind of walk them to the process of understanding that it's not uncommon to feel that you did something wrong, right? And I find that so sad, not only because of that, but because the perpetrator usually has no shame,
Mm.
right? So, and I also tell them, listen, I don't care if you're walking naked on the street. Nobody, nobody has the right to touch your body without your permission, right? No questions asked. I
Mhm.
mean, because I mean, over my lifespan, I've heard all the excuses. Oh, she was showing me her breast. She was wearing a very um, short
Short
skirt.
skirt.
Walking on the street too sexy. Blah 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 blah. And I know all these things because I used to treat sex offenders.
Mm.
I treated sex offenders for 10 years. I heard all the excuses, all of them. I mean, you name it, I've heard it, right? And when you treat sex offenders, you're trying to remove that toxicity from them, right? Some of which is biologically based, some of which is culturally based, some things are learned at home. So you need to be more cognizant of the fact that we need to get back to normal masculinity, okay, normal feminism, and neutrality. If there's people who don't like either way, that I'm fine with that, and I'm respectful of that, right? If you don't want to have a gender, fine, but don't tell me that I have to accept it. I
Hmm.
can love you, you know, I can respect you, but acceptance again is a very high bar.
I'm surprised sometimes that when these things come up because our society has changed so much. I mean, I have friends who were, had got married and had kids, and when it came to the bread earner being the wife, and more so than the man, simply for opportunity or educational reasons, the man, staying at home and being Mr. Mom. Some of these guys that I know who did that were some of the toughest dudes I've ever met. And different, and it seems, and they're very secure with what they were doing. But then other men would see that as a huge threat to their masculinity because they have to play that external role. I mean, I teach train commandos and professional fighters, and I mean, some people would say I have at least my other life is one of the most macho things you can do. But guess what? At home, I do all the cooking and the laundry. you know,
Yes.
it's that's how it is.
Yeah, but you see, I mean, we have learned to have choices and we have learned to compromise. But we have to move away from the stereotypes. We need to move away from the stereotype of what manhood is, what womanhood is, what nohood is, right? I mean, we have to look at all these things and understand that we are human beings that struggle to live together, right? And to be respectful and loving with each other, to have compassion for the suffering of others, right? But again, with full understanding of context, right? I mean, some of the most macho people that I've known, because in Latin America and in Spain and Portugal, we use the macho
Big thing.
concept, right? It's a big thing. And there's toxic machismo, is how they say in the United States, toxic machismo, right? But the reality is that most men grow up with the idea that you have to be a man, right? There's nothing wrong with that. As long as you as a person, you're willing to compromise, okay, and you're willing to share, right? I mean, some of the most beautiful, respectful, self secure people, right, that I've known and that I still know and that are friends with me are homosexual. Some of them are lesbian, right? I love them. Okay. I may not like their preference. I may not like their sexuality. I may not understand it because it's not something that I practice, but I had to be respectful of them. I had to have compassion for their suffering, right? Um, and some of the most stereotypical macho men that I've known are gay.
Yep.
You will never know they're gay, right? And they're not insecure. They're not trying to prove anything. That's just the way they are, right? So we need to learn to separate, right, differences and be respectful of it.
There's a philosopher, and his name escapes me right now. It said that we're all like porcupines, wanting to get close to one another, but we have all those spines sticking out. And because of that, it makes it difficult. But you know what? If we could retract those spines just a little bit, we might be able to do this. We actually
Well,
might be
we
able
have
to
to
get it done.
remember, uncertainty is the mother of all fears and all anxieties. So, one of the big complications of the modern world, social media and information traveling 100 miles an hour, is that there's so much uncertainty thrown at us that it's a lot easier to get lazy, get protective, and then start throwing bombs out, right?
Yep.
But you use a term that I really find fascinating, and is the idea that the most serious complication of modern technology is intellectual laziness.
Absolutely.
I mean, I was reading an article the other day, and it was about how much our vocabulary has suffered, how much we don't know how to communicate and understand each other using our words.
Which is incredibly ironic since we have the ability to communicate better than we ever have.
Yeah, but you know what? We're replacing words with images, and that
That
is
is true.
dangerous, right? We need to start using our words again. I mean, we always tell our kids, use your words.
That's right.
I think we need to start telling ourselves that use your words, listen, understand, Okay, listen to what you're going to say before you say it. Don't just show up an image expressing your frustration and emotions that you can't suit any other way, right? Because that impedes communication. And at the end, it's all about communication. It's all about transferring information, right? We're not transferring information anymore. We're transferring images. And that could be the demise of the human race.
Mm. Well, once again, Doctor, appreciate your information and your thoughts. I think there's a lot to think about on this subject. Um, and we'll see you all again next week.
Hey, thank you. And thank you very much, everybody, for listening. And we'll see you again next week. Thanks.